for this conversation, we'll be going over what this work is really about and what was the inception of this work, and I also want to invite Nikki for a conversation around what her response to the project was, because she came to the opening and she has known about my practice and is also very familiar with new media art. So before we start, I just want to say a quick word about Supersynthesis. This is just a screenshot from the opening night. And Supersynthesis is basically an interactive light and sound sculpture that is constantly accumulating, transforming, and also synthesizing the space that it's situated in. It also acts like a 24-key instrument that can be performed individually as well as with other musicians. So before we move forward, I wanna show a quick video of the work that will set the context around this conversation. It's a very rough draft of the documentation that I've been working on. So here it is. So as we move forward, Nikki, I want to invite you in the conversation and then hear what your response to the project was, and let's start the conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for inviting me here, Lee and Amay. It's a truly amazing show. And my first response would be that based on my experience with, lights, installations in general, is that the documentation couldn't really capture the true essence of the work, which is why I totally encourage everyone to see it in person, and then to also experience the work within the space, which is really nice and spacious, which allows a lot of room for the work to permeate and then to sink through. I think rather than jumping in and talk about my own experience, which is what I will save for later, I think it's nice to have a general context and then we build on top of that. Maybe starting by asking Amay a question about how this project all came about. What was your research process behind it? And what are some of your inspirations? So if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think the way this project really came about was an invitation by Lee when I was invited to the space to take over this back gallery in the back gallery space in this huge space, which is kind of divided into two phases. And then I didn't really have a work that I'd made before which could take over this entire space. So the first thing that came to my mind was actually using something that kind of spreads. So light was the first thing that came to my mind. Also, the artist who's showing alongside in the first half of the gallery, his name is Wei, whose work kind of looks like this, and he's a painter, and his work really added a lot of things to my inspiration, because I was thinking about light, and this work really was, at least my engineering mind was projecting very technically on it, because his show is called Code and Waves or Waves and Code. And I was thinking about this very technically, because waves are these things that are kind of always in motion, and he had presented it in the form of almost like a snapshot of something that's moving in space and time. So I was thinking about almost like something that's like motionless movement. That's what I was thinking when I was looking at this work. And wave also is supposed to like carry information. So when I started designing the installation or the piece, this is like the first kind of parametric design that came out, because I wanted to take that idea that Wei was working on and bring that into a sculptural form, which led to this form getting created. And all these cylinders that you see on it are actually light. But I didn't really know what the content of the sculpture would be. I knew that it had to be something interactive. So as the work started coming together, I think some of the inspiration that I had, like these are the three artists that I was looking at constantly who are light artists. And they all have like one thing that is very common in their practice was this idea of enveloping the audience with light, to create this envelope of light which kind of overtakes the audience, especially in a licensed project. I think it's called Monochromatic, and James Turrell's work, which is very meditative, and Dan Flavin's work, where he uses these fluorescent lights. But I think as I move forward, I finalized my sculptural form. I finalized the medium of light. I think the other thing that had to come in is what was the information that drove these things. And I think that for that, I was looking at these artists like Memo Acton and Roji Aikida, who work a lot with sound as well, which brought this element of sound into the project.
Wow, that's a lot of background.
Sorry.
Oh no, this is all great, because the artists that you just talked about were also in my notes. And then something on my notes that I, when we were preparing for this talk, was that it's, you know, the whole history of light installation is very Western and it's very white. And then, you know, there's the people who write about this history sometimes say that the origin of kinetic art sculpture goes back to Moholy Nagy, who's the, you know, Bauhaus artist, and then his light sculpture was on view at some point at the Art Institute. And then if you do a general Google search, you know, you get a whole lot of just white, Western white males that are doing this kind of light sculpture. But we can go back to that, because I'm bringing some, actually 3 artists I want to bring in, and then 2 of them, you know, are artists of color or working with light installation from other backgrounds, but we'll go to that. But just maybe insert another question, because you were talking about the 3 artists that you brought, you were talking about how people were enveloped with light. And then our talk's title is Language of Light. And then you really did mention something that really captured my attention, was that there is no light if there's no darkness, or the other way around. And then your installation really built also on this trying to blur this duality between light and darkness. And then, you know, the gallery was occupied with darkness to some extent. So maybe talk about that, maybe talk about how or what darkness is to you, and then how you approach your installation fairly differently from your, you know, your inspirations and your examples.
For sure. I think darkness was something that I had to really take into consideration, because a lot of the work philosophically that I do is kind of rooted in this idea of duality, these contradictions and these paradoxes that we look at in nature. And I think as I've started closely looking at the world, like these paradoxes like really come straight at your face. And I've been thinking a lot about them in the past couple of years as I've developed works like my holons and holarchy project, which is all about like the part and the whole. And when I was thinking about light, I think the thing, you can't really think about darkness without light, just how you cannot really think about democracy without tyranny. You know, it always has like this other side of the coin that it brings. But our minds are so conditioned to look at the world as like only the one side. If you're looking at light, we're so focused on light, we forget about what it brings with it. So I think when I was thinking about this project, I was obviously like this, I don't know if this even comes out, like I think the project is incomplete without these moments of darkness that obviously come in these rhythms that are created. But I was thinking a lot about how any sort of light experience is incomplete without being also be devoid of light. And because that itself makes it a whole, not just like the part of light and dark, the whole experience. It's either one comes, the one doesn't really come without the other, they all come together. Good doesn't really come without the evil, democracy doesn't really come without tyranny, light doesn't really come without darkness. They all kind of come together. And I think that wholeness was something that I really enjoyed when I was developing the work and I was writing all the software, because every time like a pattern or a sequence would finish, like it just felt really strange to not have that element of darkness in it, because that's what kind of fulfilled, or that's what kind of like made the entire experience whole for me. So when I was thinking about the language of light, I think one thing which also I was thinking a lot about when we were discussing this title was just language. I mean, light in general is something that is all around us, and it helps us create this image of the world in our minds. But language is what helps interpret this world. So language also acts like light. Language is what enlightens the image of the world in our minds. So I was thinking, if language is like light and light is something that also enlightens the world, then can there be like a language of light? It's almost like kind of turning it around and questioning, okay, if language acts like light, then can there be a light, or can there be a language of light? And then I think that's where it kind of started entering like this poetic territory, where I was like, okay, there's no clear cut, maybe there is like a clear cut dialectic answer or like a didactic answer to it, but I think the answers really lied in the architecture where the light was situated, or the objects on which it fell, or the space that the installation was occupying, or the source of the lights. For example, these LED lights, or this vinyl that is spread underneath it, or these cables, or these bodies that were coming in the space, and how they were interacting with light. I think that's where the language of light really lied for me. There was not really like a clear-cut answer, but it was something that was very poetic about how light was falling on these objects, or how light was getting emanated from the source, which kind of gave me these elements of what language of light could be comprised really of.
I think building on top of that, there's also this idea of communications where you see the light sculpture and then what you can retain from it after you see it. There's let me bring in this reference first. This is what I love. Zoom Talk, you can just slap references in the chat, and if people see it, you know, they open different website. And so Kurt Hinschlager is really something I think of. He is a German Austrian artist who was a visiting artist at the SIC, and then he taught for 3 years. I saw his installation at Mana Contemporary in New York. It was called Sub. That was in 2019. And then the idea that he really prohibits any form of documentation from the visitor, because even just by pulling it out of your phone and light the screen, you inevitably introduce an additional light source that he did not want. And then he tried to build this absolute dark space where when you see the flashing light from the LED screen, when the lights is gone, you have this what's called retinal after image. So when you close your eyes, it's the opposite to what Dan Flavin and James Turrell was doing. You are enveloped with darkness, and yet you see images in front of your eyes that's not even from the light source, but the after image. So that's something really interesting, and I think I see a little bit of that in your work as well, because the lights were changing from one LED to another, and then this, the the light that lingers from the previous one is superimposed with the one that's currently being lit. And then that, to me, seems to be a kind of grammar that you're trying to build when you talk about the language of light.
Yeah, that's a really good reading of that. And thanks for showing us that reference.
Oh yeah, of course. There are just two more references that I really want to just slap in the chat maybe, and then we can talk about it. Another reference, things I think about when I saw your installation is, of course, David Hammond's early light installation. I'm not sure if it's right to call it light installation. It's called Concerto in black and blue, which is again a black space, and every visitor was given a flashlight of blue lights. Oh, and then the link to it is not an image, it's more just an article which people can read. But the idea is that this artist, being an African-American artist, trying to steer away from some of the stereotype of African-American art, and then think about light and darkness being metaphor for his racial identity, which is such a powerful and yet simple way of using light or the absence of it to convey a message. And I'll just slap the other reference here as well, because it's the third reference will be Tromorama, which I can think of is an Indonesian collective of 3 artists, and then they've been doing a whole lot of installations of all sorts. That's also, again, powered by computer algorithm. They frequently take input from the social media and try to translate or abstract the information and then put them into some kind of representation. So like if you see here David Hammond's title and Tromorama's title, it's Concerto and Soliloquy. And then it's, mostly light installation or installation about lights or darkness. And yeah, they both have a title that includes sound. And I'm not entirely sure if both installations actually had sound components, but it's just the idea that the language of light is very tightly related or often connected to the language of sound. And then maybe it's a nice segue to talk about sound component here, or how you think about language of light also through sound.
Absolutely. I think I was looking at these references earlier, and I think this project actually spoke a lot to me about, especially like the way the light actually moved in the space. It very much was similar to how I was controlling the lights, at least programmatically. But I think that's a great question. Moving into sound, like when I was making the work, I didn't really understand what the content would be until I introduced this idea of sound, right? Like I was looking at this work and things were getting built and there were lights that were turning on and off. But until I thought about how sound could be introduced in the project, like I didn't really know where this was heading. I knew that this had to be interactive, but just having it being interactive with light was almost feeling incomplete. I don't know, like if this was intuition or if this was just something. So, and since I was thinking about waves, because waves really became my subject matter to kind of start with, the addition of sound felt very natural and intuitive to me to be added in the project. And I think this is a really good image for that. So for sound, I actually worked with another artist. His name is Tim Kwasny. And it was actually quite interesting collaborating with him because he has an MFA in sound art, but his background is actually in music composition. So I was looking for somebody who kind of could look at sound in a very simple way, but still in a very poetic way, because I also have like a decent amount of sound background. Like I grew up playing the guitar, I learned how to read music. But for this project, I was just so swamped with other things that I was like, okay, it'll be nice to bring in a collaborator who can actually build on the sound element specifically with their expertise. And I think from my skills, I know I'm very good with like architecting things. I'm very good with like large scale kind of design stuff. So when I built the architecture for the sound, I knew I wanted somebody who could like really go in and hone in on the character of the sound. And I think when I was thinking about sound, like we just had like regular conversations about how the project looked like. There were things that we brought up like of an organ. This almost reminded both of us of an organ. I mean, these are the designs that we were looking at. It's 24 lights, 12 notes in a chromatic scale. So these were like two chromatic scales kind of sequentially aligned together. There were talks about almost creating like a temple of light, where the sound almost like creates a sphere around you. And when you come into it, I mean, the way the sound is actually happening in the space right now is that there is a stereo sound. As you come in, you're literally in between the two speakers. So sound is getting bombarded towards you from both the sides as it's panning from left and right. So we didn't really have like a very specific prompt about what the sound has to be like. I think we were just kind of working iteratively, and as Tim was designing the sound, I could come back to it, and he would share these samples with me, and then I could go and update it or edit it, and then start integrating it into the main project. So I think the element of sound, like I told before, was also kind of inspired by these two artists who use sound so regularly in their practice, and is so tied to the visual the visual element. Because I knew like the thing that's most fulfilling about like a sound experience, especially when it's combined with the visual experience, is this alignment of the visual output with the sound output. So that's why I feel like it was like a no-brainer to attach a sound for each light that was turning on. So a note on was just like associated with the light on, and a note off is associated with the light off. But since these note ons and offs were happening so fast that, like you said before, they kind of superimposed on top of each other, and sometimes they were also getting triggered together. So it almost created like a polyphonic effect, which kind of fills you with this movement of sound that's almost like very surreal. It's almost quite magical. And I mean, as we started adding effects, because we were looking for something that kind of fills the room, we were working with like reverbs and delays and stuff like that. Just some effects that can kind of help us magnify the sound to fill the room completely. And I think before I hand it over to you, Nikki, like one thing that's worth mentioning here is also like this interface that is used to control the sound. Because one thing that was very clear for me since the beginning, that this project has to be interactive in some way. And there's obviously an interactive interface that we can talk about, but there was another level of interaction that was used to control sound, and just the character of the sound. So this was the interface that we had control over, the audience tent, where we could go and control the sound and use it in a performative aspect or in a performative mode.
Yeah, sounds a perfect segue to interactivity, which is so crucial to this installation. And then also thinking about the term of interactivity, right? Like it's so flooded everywhere. And then we talk about interactivity in all sorts of ways. And then it becomes this really vague word. And we start to think like, what is interactivity at all? I remember in my conversation with Chris Mitchell, when he was there in Chicago, was that I tried to ask him about interactivity, and he's like, so what is it? Like, if you show a painting and then the audience was able to see it, that already is some kind of interactivity, because the colors or, materiality, whatnot, are engaging the audience member in some way. And then they have this mental and physical engagement of the work. And then if they start to talk about it, to the artist again, then it closes the feedback loop of this interactivity. So it would be great to hear from you, Amay, like what you determine as interactivity. And then I think here, in particular to your work, there's already a collaborative aspect to it between you and Tim when you were making the work, and then you were introducing audience members again to this collectivity. So I'm thinking now, like, maybe we can shift from interactivity to collectivity. Now you're inviting a lot of people to, in a way, participate in this work that's contributing to the result of the work. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think these are two great ideas of interaction and collectivity, which are very strongly present in this project, actually, for me. Starting off with interactivity, I think to respond to Kurt's comments, I've thought about interactivity quite a bit because, I mean, when I was doing my MFA, a lot of the work that I was making was actually interactive, but I did a big shift towards simulation driven work, which is more autopoietic in nature, like driven by algorithms underneath the system itself rather than surfacing any sort of control to the user. And there were all these questions about agency and control, but honestly, like I was like, we need to simplify this whole conversation and not make it so philosophical, like, and make it so complicated, because at the end of the day, like, a user comes into the space, they either have some control over the artwork or either they don't have any control over the artwork. It's as simple as that in my mind. So I mean, I think I was thinking about interactivity and I started classifying it according to like the works that I've made into three categories. I think all these works that I make are interactive in nature, and these ideas can be also taken and overlap with somebody who's going to the museum and looking at a painting. So the first category for interactivity that I think is almost like passive interaction, where a user comes into the space. Let's say they come into the new gallery and they experience the piece, and they create some sort of intellectual conversation with the lights, and they see the rhythms or whatever happens. They don't have any sort of agency over the work, and neither do they wish to execute any agency over the work or any sort of control over the work. So they don't modify the work. And there is some interactivity that's happening, but I just like to call it passive because they don't get to change the character of the work. Then there is active interaction, which is very clear in this kind of interface, where there is like a one-on-one association between what you do and what you see. So as you, for example, in the Supersynth mode, what you could do is you could use this as a keyboard, as a 24 key keyboard. So whatever button that you press, you get a direct note on response from the work. So it's a one-on-one response that you get from the project. And then there is this other interactivity, which is in the exhibition mode of the project, which I like to call sustained interaction, which is kind of like a mix of active interaction and also this idea of a memory-based interaction, where when you're interacting with the project, like obviously the project is also responding back to you as just like an active interaction does. But there's also this idea of sustenance, where the project itself holds a memory of that interaction. In this case, I store every single response that the user creates, and which is stored inside like a database as a snapshot of that user response, along with the date and time, along with the pattern and the score that they create. So that for me is like a new sort of interactivity that I almost landed upon because of the project that I was making in 2020 called Mom I'm Safe, where I started storing all these responses that were coming from other people into a database. And I realized that this almost became like a memory of the project. It was not anymore like an ethereal kind of thing where the project came and then it went and it only existed in documentation, but now it had like a memory associated with it. It had like almost like this tangible presence beyond the project's existence, which did not just exist in documentation, but it existed in something that can be used and created like its own kind of artwork. So this, I think that's the same model that I used 2 years ago in that project was something that I was projecting on and started using in this project, because I wanted to keep a memory of all these interactions that people were making. And I think as of today, let's see, if I go to the website, there's 482 responses that have been received on this project, which are great. I mean, I should probably go and do something with them at some point of time. But for me, like now the project exists beyond the space and time in which it's existing right now. Like maybe next year there might be some new works that will come out of these responses that have been collected. So that's my take on interactivity. What do you think?
This is wonderful. I mean, I don't have a response to this. I don't think it's really nice just to hear what you say about it, and then I think everyone can have very different definition of interactivity.
Absolutely.
And then it definitely is very visible in your work, and I think it all came together. And I think, as you mentioned, the process and then recording everyone's input, I can come back to how my initial response to your work, because my first response is that the idea of abstraction in your process of collecting people's response. Because when you showed me the iPad where I got to control a little bit the interface that controls the lights, I realized it's not really something that I can do about it. I can draw on it, but then it doesn't seem like the lights were necessarily are having a direct response right to what I input. So that got me thinking about how you came about with the idea of abstracting people's input in this way. And then to me, it seems really crucial that the ambiguity of how you collect data, comparing to some light installation, let's say, thinking about TeamLab, thinking about maybe more commercial acts where once you put an input, you touch the screen and then suddenly you activate some kind of light response, and that seems very direct. And then that's just input output. There's no ambiguity. It seems like you're in full command of the work. It puts you in a superpower. It controls our work, and our work is just this inferior entity that the response. But your work seems like it's more of a collaboration between human and machine, and then human with human, and then the end result seems to be a superimposition of so many people's inputs that in the end you don't know where you're at as a user, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a very good point about this whole collaboration aspect. Like I got a lot of feedback. I spent a lot of time on this interface, and I did studio visits with a bunch of people, my studio mates, and I was getting critiqued a lot on how complicated the interface was in the beginning, and had to do a lot of work to simplify it. But one thing that I did not absolutely budge on was this model of ambiguity, like that you mentioned, which is this idea of almost collaborating with the machine. I hope you guys can see my screen, right? You can see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Yeah. So because I think this model of interaction was something, again, like I stumbled upon when I was making this project, to almost have this almost like an element of mystery to it, rather than having, because I mean, I've done like a lot of music production in the past, and the way you would interact with like a sequencer, you would go and draw these notes, and then whatever you kind of hover on and you click on, like that note gets activated. So that was a model that I was so conditioned with, that anybody who would come in and try to use this would try and go for that, which I wanted to break away from. Like as artists, you're always like, okay, let's try not to move towards where everybody else is moving. So I wanted to kind of break away from that model and see what other ways could there be to make this a little bit more mysterious, to make this a little bit more different, to make this a little bit more unconventional. So as I was kind of iterating on the interactive model, I came up with this model, which almost feels like, I don't know, these like wires or strings kind of pulling these things up and down, almost like this idea of motion that is so present in the work to be also present in this interface. And I think that mystery, or that almost, which you call ambiguity, is something for me very poetic in my mind, is something that is unconventional. It's something that is different from the past models. And I wanted to try that out and see what the response is going to be like. Because like you said, you come in and then you kind of draw something on it. You think you are in control, you're doing something, but really like things are happening. You have some control of activating the piece, but what comes out through it is really beyond your control, because there is somebody else who's kind of working with you to decide and make the decision. So I feel like that's something that's very present in my work in general, about like this human machine collaboration, because my work sometimes gets so tech heavy that I can't make progress in my project if I don't have the help of the machine, if I don't have the help of the algorithms that I write, which gives some control to the machine to take the decisions. And I think that's why this model of interaction works really well for me, as compared to something that's more in control of the user. And I think this is a pretty good segue into also talking about collectivity, and how this idea of superimposition and kind of taking these things and almost overlapping on top of each other was so important for me here. And I think to really talk about that collective aspect, like you're seeing these 488 responses that have been collected, like whenever a new response is created, every user, let's say like there are multiple users in the space who are using this on the phone, they all get updated with this new interface, and now they have to use this as this new foundation to draw whatever they are drawing on. And the machine is obviously working with them on it. And I think this idea of collectivity was almost something that I started moving towards as I was thinking of this work, not just externally, but also something that's happening internally, and how like my mind was working, and how like my thoughts are getting created, or my thoughts are actually working to create this project. And I think one thing that I was reflecting on after this project ended, which was almost like an internal observation of how our minds work, and I was kind of projecting that on this, was basically like the way we collect information and the way we think is, we think that it's ours, but it really is coming from our environment. It's coming from our surroundings. It's almost like we are connected to some sort of a hive mind that's out there. I mean, once somebody asked Thomas Edison that, hey, how do you get these ideas that you have? And he said that ideas are actually in the air. You just have to pick these ideas from air. So it was pretty interesting to hear that, because that's how our minds are conditioned. We think like our ideas are unique, our ideas belong to us, but our ideas are really because of the ideas that are out there. And that's why I think this idea of collecting thoughts, or collecting these scores, makes really sense for me in this project, because here I'm also acting like, here the machine or the project is acting like a mind, a hive mind that is collecting all these ideas from outside and then responding back with its own interpretation, or let's say a controlled or an algorithmic interpretation of what it thinks these ideas mean. So I think once these ideas are coming out, then it creates a feedback loop. Let's say all the people who are in the space, they look at this and then they make their own interpretation and then enter their own thing, and then it becomes a feedback loop. And this is a pretty good example, I feel, of how we also think, like how we also act. Like we get some information, we do something in the world, and then we get a response from it. Like our brains are like cybernetically designed, just to kind of historically reference something.
Yeah, it seems a perfect place or moment for you to talk about the title a little bit, because there's definitely some meaning to the word supersynthesis that you're trying to convey to this title, right?
Yeah, I think, I don't know what am I trying to convey here, or if I'm trying to convey something here, but I can tell you how the title came into existence. I mean, supersynthesis is actually a combination of two things. One is superposition, which is a word that we have used multiple times in this conversation already. And the superposition is also like a term that comes from quantum mechanics, which is all about wave particle duality and things like that. And which is, in simple terms, is exactly what you said. When things are moving really fast, they almost try to like superimpose on each other, and they create this almost ethereal or the surreal effect. And quantum mechanics, it's explained more technically. And the other thing is additive synthesis, which is a sound phenomena, which basically is again a concept that we use in sound to design the sound, which basically means that every sound that we hear in this world can be composed of, or it can be created by adding little sine tones. So all the sound that you hear, all the different characters of sound that you hear in this project are actually created by combining multiple sine tones. So when these two ideas kind of got combined, one which comes from this phenomena of light and the other which comes from this phenomena of sound, that combined together made Supersynthesis.
Nice. I think we can, because we're only having 8 minutes left, maybe to see if there's any questions from the audience members. If not, we can keep talking, because we can go on and on.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're an introvert like me, you can absolutely just put your questions in the chat, because I don't normally want to ask questions in this format, but you can put questions whenever you want in the chat, and then I'll make sure, or Amay, you can take a look up the chat and see if there's any new questions. But I think in the meantime, I definitely want to hear about the next steps, because I think artists I've talked to, sometimes, like they're trapped in one project, or they think that, oh, this is not done yet. How do I move forward? How do I get out of it? How do I start a new project? So to you, what is projects at? And I can definitely see a lineage of this project from your previous work. Like there's interactive components throughout. There's the help or the input from computers, and just want to hear what your next steps are, and then some of your plans maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, please feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and we can address them. So for the next steps, I think obviously like this project, I don't think is still complete in the sense that it's complete in the sense how it's presented right now in the gallery space. But I think it's incomplete because these responses that have been collected from the users, it's something that I need to figure out what to do with them. Because for example, in my Mom I'm Safe project, those responses became the material for new works. So similarly, I feel for this project, I think those responses are going to become a material for a new visual series of work, or maybe like even a visual and a sound series of work. So I think in that sense, this project is not complete in my mind. But I also think like this is a very new area for me. For example, light in its raw sense. I mean, I've worked with screens, I've worked with pixels, I've worked with moving images. So time-based medium is not absolutely new to me, but light as a medium is very new to me. And I think it's very exciting. It's been really like, I think I've learned so much through this project at every single step, not just like while making this step, but also while interacting with people, like while coordinating so many things. I think there's just been, as an artist, I've grown so much through this project. This is really nothing like what I've done in the past before. So I think these learnings are very critical at this stage of my career. And I think I want to use them not only to scale my practice, like scale it up, but also to investigate this medium further, and to see if all this material that I've collected and brought together can be used and repurposed to create new projects. Maybe it doesn't have to be so involved, or maybe it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but there could be so many other formal explorations that we can do with this, that I feel can be done with this. But I think time will tell like what happens in the future. But for now, I think wherever the project is, I feel it's fairly complete in my mind, and I'm pretty happy with how it has come together. And especially, it could not be possible without all you guys, like Nikki, Lee, and everybody who came and supported it.
Yeah, this is fascinating to think about how, to me, time-based art is like liquid. It changes depending on the vessel that it puts it in. The vessels that holds the work would be the gallery space, the places that you put the work in, and then it's gonna change in so many different iterations as you show this work in other venues in the future. And then I just want to address the question from the chat. Thank you so much, Jasper. Huge congrats. Love thinking of this work as a metaphor for collaboration, where the ideas come from. Can you talk more about the program that responded to people's inputs in the interface?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the program is actually a website which is deployed on this hyperlink called supersynthesis.art, and these are just some screenshots of me designing it and iterating on it. For example, earlier there were these two kind of sections, one on top, one on the bottom, which represented things moving forward and then backward. And the reason why this interface actually exists is because I was really determined to have two modes for the project. One was an exhibition mode, which was only controlled by the website and the people who would interact with the work. And the other one was a performance mode. So performance mode was something that only I controlled as a performing artist, to be able to affect the work, let's say to play it, or maybe to even collaborate with other musicians. And this website is really just like a small lightweight interface that lets users have some sort of control over the project. And here, if we go and see it, every it's actually glitching a little bit. So every light gray shade, I don't know if you can clearly see it or not, that represents one of the lights actually in the installation. So there are 24 gray shades, and all these white things that you see are the lights that will be turned on. The red dot that you see that's moving is how the machine is actually thinking underneath. It's basically acting like a sequencer with multiple patterns. So every time the red dot lands on a spot, then it lights up that light. That's how the interface is actually working, and it has these patterns that split from the center, or maybe like this is a random pattern. I think there are 3 or 4 of them that kind of go. And then as you start interacting with this website, then you are crafting a new score, because each of these lights is actually corresponding to a sonic element as well, right? And then you can send it to the installation. So right now in the gallery, the score has been sent, and now the lights are playing this score. And every time, like whichever, let's say another user is operating on this in another part of the world, they'll see the score getting reflected on their computers immediately. So the interface was basically created to have this exhibition element to give users certain kind of control, but then it also informed the meaning of the work significantly for me. I think the work kind of exists in a very different kind of meaning when it's in an exhibition mode, where it's collecting all these user inputs and working based on that.
We're getting a lot of great questions in the chat. I'll have to throw it to Lee to see if we have more time to address these questions. Otherwise,
if the Zoom meeting, as long as the Zoom call doesn't go out on us because of a time limit, you're more than welcome to answer the questions if you want to stay on. If anyone, it's probably a good time if anyone wants to duck out, you can, but it's been very informative. I think, Amay, you probably have some time to answer some questions. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, why don't you pick from the chat? We're getting so many great questions.
Yeah, some wonderful questions.
Nikki, why don't you pick?
I'll start. How about this one? You had Sal Marino play at the opening. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit of why you felt like bringing in a live act and incorporating that on top of all the other elements in the sculpture was something that you felt was, I don't know if necessary is the right word, but why did you kind of feel like that was a part of the sculpture and how it affected that night and everyone's interaction with the sculpture itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sal was a really critical part a critical part of the project, because I wanted to see how another sound artist would actually respond to the work. Because for me, like I said, like this work acts in these two modes. One is a performative mode and one is an exhibition mode. So I wanted to really see how another performance artist like Sal would actually respond to this. And the way we actually performed the piece was very extempore. Like we did not rehearse anything. We did not we talked about the work. I showed him how the sounds are played. I showed him how I control the interface. He also used the interface and could control it and could see what are all the possibilities. But for me, I think bringing him into the space and almost interacting with him was almost trying to create like this conversation between these two practices, between these two almost like art languages, like this was like a language of light. There was another language of body that he brought into the piece. So I think those two languages, when they came together, I was just very curious to see what kind of an effect it would create. And I went back and looked at the documentation, and I honestly, like, there were some moments which were working really well, and then there were some moments that were completely like out of sync. And I think that's the beauty of it, right? I feel there's some things that work for me, and there were some lessons that I learned. Okay, how would I perform this with another musician? Maybe a little bit of rehearsal would be good for the future. But I think for this piece, for the first time, I think having this almost like at the edge, almost taking it as a risk, was something that was adventurous for me.
I think John Cage would be very proud of the piece.
Okay.
The way that you worked with the other musician, and even the way that he coded out the music and the sound for it, reminds me very much of how John Cage kind of goes about composing his ridiculous sounds and music. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions on there that kind of stick out to you?
I'm just it's good to sorry, I was just reading the questions. I think it's nice to combine Gary's 关于Shu's question with Aisha, because they both address the installation, spaces around the work, or just maybe spaces that we're not really focusing on previously. Was talking about the chords, as the presence of the chords as part of the installation, whereas Aisha was talking about how you incorporate audiences and then their physical presence and how their shadow, interact with the lights. So I think it's really interesting if you can answer both questions in one manner, where you talk about maybe the periphery. Let's not talk about periphery. Sounds inferior, but just another part of installation that we haven't talked about yet.
Of course. I think we briefly touched upon it, because when we were talking about the language of light, right? And as I was thinking, what really constitutes the language of light? And I think one of the things that actually constitutes to it very significantly is the architecture and the space on which light befalls, or the objects on which the light befalls. So here in this case, it's the chords, for example, that are coming out, and it was a very, very deliberate decision to not really try and hide them, but to kind of embrace them, because they add like this element of poeticness to it. They add this element of like this, they kind of strengthen the technological presence of the work, which I did not want to hide at all. Similarly, the space that's around that it's in, like there was a lot of thinking that I had to do. Okay, where would this piece be? Would it be on the wall? Would it be on the side? But I decided that, okay, I want to make something that kind of sits in the center, where people can kind of almost like gather or huddle around, almost like a bonfire, like everybody gets together. It becomes like this point of social contact, like we're all kind of getting together around a bonfire, which is like the source of light. For me, that's how I kind of imagined this piece to be, where people are around it, and and this being on the floor was something like a very deliberate call as well. I was expecting people to kind of literally like bend down and sit right next to it. Sal was very, very intentional about being very close to the piece. In the entire performance, he was moving right next to the piece. So I think all these elements contributed to the language of light. Like I did not really know how it would happen, but I had a vague idea of how I wanted to, or what elements I was looking for to contribute to the piece, because the piece is really incomplete without the bodies who were in the space, without these chords on which the light is getting reflected, because they all kind of add to this aesthetic language that I was going for. They all kind of add to this poetic interpretation of the piece, which looks like almost like a brain, like connected with these wires, and where we are feeding all this information into this brain and it's acting based on this information. So I think all this kind of acts and adds towards the language of light, which I started working with and trying to, I think it all adds to the learnings that I'm having as I started building this piece.
Right, and I think it also brings more forward the technology itself, right? Like we kind of see this paradigm shift from early on, where the artist tried to hide every single piece of technology behind the wall, so you get the very slick light. Like for example, if you walk into James Toura, you don't know where the light comes from. It's such a black box way of presenting only the work itself and hiding everything else. And then moving forward, we start to see chords being part of the show, you know, especially anything that's time-based. You ultimately need electricity, and then the presence of the chord kind of also, you know, it's a constant reminder of the infrastructure which allows such work to exist at all. And then maybe we can end with the last question that I can find, you know, a little bit on using memories for your past project, and that as a inspiration for this project, and then we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I see that's a question that's posed by my brother, and he's very familiar with the Mom I'm Safe project that I made in 2020, which really was like a cornerstone for me in terms of how I approached net art. I mean, part of this project is like I said, it kind of exists on a website. I mean, that part is completely independent of what's happening. For example, if somebody comes on this website, like I want them to experience this this thing as it's almost like its own. And one of the things that I'm trying to add to this is also sound elements, so they can actually experience the same sound that they're experiencing it in the exhibition space. So I feel like the whole idea of memories really emanated in that project, where COVID was hitting. There was no physical space that I could exhibit in, because a lot of my work was really like physical work, sculptural, installation based work. So at that point of time, I had to make a very quick decision. Okay, if I want to sustain as an artist, I need to quickly pivot towards the web. And the first project that I made was Mom I'm Safe, where I started collecting these messages from my mom, from my friends, from everybody, all my family in the world, as almost like these antidotes of like or like almost like these like, what do you say, antidotes of loneliness, because I mean we were all stuck inside, and I was like, okay, I need some way of keeping myself motivated. And I think by creating a bridge using this online interface to kind of actively be in touch with my friends and family really worked with that model, or with that project. And I think that's where this idea of memories came, because after that project ended, which is now running in some sort of like an archived way, the project still lives because of all the messages, all the data that has been collected in the past. And I feel like that's an interesting way of preserving a project. That's an interesting way of looking at the future of what a project lives, especially like new media art, because it's all so ephemeral. It's so like it all so temporal, right? Like new media art is always like moving, and like you said, it's like liquid. So for me, I think these memories kind of give it a little bit of a solidified meaning, something that can come back and then create like some sort of an association or like a pointer back to the past. Like now we can go back and look at these 500 messages and see, okay, yeah, these were the messages that were sent to it during the month of March when this project ran, maybe 5 years from today. So I think that they kind of solidify this idea of or they kind of turn this idea of being liquid upside down and then look at new media art in a different way. I think that's how I would like to respond to it.
Fantastic. That was great. The timing and everything is perfect. How about that? It's about an hour since we started talking. That's fantastic. That was a wonderful presentation. I think you hit on a lot of amazing points. I like the whole interaction thing took me by surprise and blew my mind when you brought it in. So I think that was like a huge addition to the sculpture and really sets it apart from a lot of other light installations that I've seen in the past. And I'm so thrilled that you were able to build that and put it in New Gallery.